Hey guys, this is Ian, and welcome to another episode of ACC Audible. Joined by my buddy Ken here. Obviously, we've slacked a little bit the last couple of weeks. You might have noticed we haven't had a new podcast. Well, that's kind of our fault, kind of not our fault. We've actually recorded a couple podcasts, which will be loaded up about the same time this one is. But unfortunately, with the hurricane down there going through Tallahassee area where Ken lives, we just had a couple of delays in recording and a couple of technical difficulties as well with some of our files and stuff. So we're back on track now, which is awesome because we had a couple of low weeks in the ACC with only 4 or 5 conference games. So pretty cool that we're getting back into the meat of the ACC schedule and our technology works all at the same time. It's almost like our technology enjoys ACC football. But Ken, I hear a rumor that we've changed everything this week. Not only has our technology changed, but we are completely changing our podcast format. Is that rumor true?
You know, everyone needs a bye week in the off season. Look at what you're doing wrong. Look what you're doing right. You know, change some things up and come out with maybe a new plan. So we're going to switch things up a little bit. It's not going to be too crazy different. I will say we're not going to spend as much time recapping the weekend action. Not that it's not important, but everyone has ESPN. You can always look up scores and highlights. But we're going to be a little more topical here in the future. A little things that talk about topics that maybe you guys find interesting. Really things that we find interesting that just we would talk about anyway. But with that being said, I will do some recap just to let you guys know if you did miss any of the action this previous weekend, just to catch you up just a little bit. So not too crazy different, but we'll be discussing hopefully some more interesting topics here in the future.
Yeah, Ken and I just kind of realized there's a lot of topics we love talking about that, you know, fun things about the ACC or particular players or maybe strategies and stuff that we didn't get a chance to talk about because we're spending too much time recapping. So you guys have ESPN, and if you don't care about some of these other teams, you're not going to listen to what we say anyway. But topically, we think that a lot of these topics will be interesting to everyone in the ACC and can affect everything in the conference. So kind of like an Alabama team coached by Nick Saban, we knew we were already good, but we changed and got even better. So kind of like that. Yeah, I know. That's how good we are. I'm going to pass it on to Ken to do the Blitz. That's what I'm going to call it, even though Ken said that he hates it. This is the Blitz, where he is going to quickly recap every game from last weekend, which fortunately there weren't too many of them.
Yeah, man, this is where I need that music for that Boomer has on NFL Live, you know. But
nice.
no music for us. But yeah, only 4 games this last week. Kind of a slow week. A lot of bye weeks for a lot of teams in the ACC. We had Syracuse and UNC had a great game, really high scoring offensive game. Went into double overtime. Storylines here. Tommy DeVito comes in for Eric Dungey late in the fourth quarter, ends up winning them the game. He went 11 for 19, 3 touchdowns. Really great even game. Both teams eclipsed 500 yards of offense. Both teams had 1 fumble, 1 interception. We're going to talk about Eric Dungey and Tommy DeVito later in the podcast to see who you guys think maybe should start for that team. Syracuse is doing really well. That was a great win for them. But moving forward, there seems to be maybe a little question mark from the Syracuse faithful. So game number 2 was UVA at Duke. And man, both you and I did not see this coming. UVA 28, Duke 14. Really impressive win for the Cavaliers. Honestly, I thought Duke had this game. I think UVA just put everyone in the Coastal on notice, especially Virginia Tech. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. This next game wasn't even really close. Clemson 41, NC State 17. I can't imagine why anyone would pick NC State. That's just ridiculous. But I did. Whoops. Clemson, they didn't even rush for 100 yards. Etienne actually was kept in check, even though he had 3 touchdowns. He only had 39 yards on the ground. But honestly, they didn't need him. The defense was dominant the entire game. They played situations well. They played red zone defense great. That defensive line, we all know what they are. Trevor Lawrence, in his first start against a ranked opponent, played very well, had over 300 yards of offense. And Clemson, with another Atlantic Division title, again, I believe the 3rd or 4th in a row now. And then last game was Florida State 38, Wake Forest 17. Wake coming off the bye week. They had a little juice early. We're up 10-0 early. Dominated the first quarter, really. Ran over 40 plays. Had over 190 yards of total offense. The FSU defense was able to adjust. Francois continues to play okay, but not great. Went 29 of 40, 353 yards and 2 touchdowns. We're going to talk a little bit about Florida State later on in the podcast, but overall, a good conference win for them. So that kind of wraps up just basically what went on this weekend. Ian, any big thoughts about the games this week?
Yeah, definitely. Great job picking NC State to win this weekend, Ken. I really appreciated that. You were getting close to me. You were only down a couple of games, so now you're back 3 games. You picked NC State. I picked Clemson. We both took Duke this weekend. I know we mentioned briefly in the last podcast about how we thought UVA could upset Duke there, but UVA was riding high after Miami. There's no way they keep it up 2 weeks in a row. We were both wrong. Florida State took it to Wake Forest, obviously a little bit close at first, and then they pulled away. We got that one correct, and we got Syracuse correct in a game which was really entertaining, as you said, double overtime, quarterback change there, and also North Carolina has played really, really well the last few weekends in losses. Their record looks really, really ugly right now. However, they've looked pretty dang good against Virginia Tech, where they lost with 19 seconds left, and then now against Syracuse, where they took a double overtime. So just kind of an interesting note there. NC State, I don't know what to even think of them. Obviously missing that West Virginia game with the Hurricane gave a lot of question marks because we haven't seen them against a premier opponent. And Clemson really has picked up steam the last couple of weeks. When they beat Wake Forest, was it 66-3 or something? That just opened a lot of people's eyes because a lot of people thought maybe Clemson's not as good this year. And then they're like, wow, they are good. And then coming off a bye week, they clearly showed that they are ready to go. And they took it to NC State. Good for UVA. You said putting Virginia Tech on notice. I think putting the whole Coastal on notice for sure, because this is a team that I even said on this podcast before does not have a shot this year at winning the Coastal. I thought they'd make a bowl game, and I said that. But man, they're looking really good right now. The UVA Cavaliers, great for them. Great for Bronco Mendenhall. Kind of a coaching hire that's was interesting because it wasn't a young up-and-coming guy. It was an established guy. But he's doing great things there. And Wake Forest, congratulations, only giving up 38 points this weekend. That's pretty good for their defense. So we'll have to give some credit to them. Only 38, only mustering 17, of course. They are not looking good there at Wake Forest. Definitely a shocker. But Ken, we said we were going to make this a little bit topical. Okay, so topic number 1 is that I'm beating you by 3 games right now. Okay,
that's not an interesting topic. No one wants to hear that. No.
I'm just messing. But I would love to, before we get into the headlines, because we could talk about the headlines for a long time, I want to quickly just jump through our picks for this coming weekend with you right now off the bat. Before we get to talk through stuff, because that's cheating, I just want to hear off the top of your head who you think is going to win these games. And this weekend we have Thursday, Friday, and Saturday ones. So Thursday night, Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech in Blacksburg. Who you have?
In this one, going Virginia Tech, man. I think ever since that tough loss to that team I won't mention, I think this team's been playing well. You know, Fuente has said it's going to be an up and down battle because these kids are young, but I think they are trending in the right direction. I will be interested. Georgia Tech is one of those teams that for me is kind of tough to predict, but I'm going to go with Virginia Tech in this one. This is always a great matchup. We were at this game last year in Atlanta. I expect it to be awesome. I know you're going to be down there in Blacksburg for this game this week, so I think it's going to be a great game, but I'm going to go with Virginia Tech in this one.
I'm going to go with Virginia Tech as well, and it's always a good game. It comes down to one possession almost every time, it seems like lately. Some really great nail-biter games to send Virginia Tech to bowl games or go home type of situations the last couple of years. Last year we saw Virginia Tech had, I think it was 4th and 1. They were down like 4 or 5 points, and Fuente had his quarterback throw like a 30-yard pass that was incomplete. And so we're all saying, wow, on 4th and 1, why do that with 2 minutes left? Ended up being a crazy game. Fuente's never beaten Georgia Tech. Paul Johnson has had his number. I remember at home a couple years ago, Georgia Tech went up 20-0. Virginia Tech slowly came back in the second half, but lost 30-20 just because you make a turnover, you're screwed essentially against Georgia Tech unless they do the same. Georgia Tech's made a lot of mistakes this year, decent amount of fumbles. Their defense isn't as good. Virginia Tech's defense isn't as good, but their run defense has been decent. Their pass defense is where they're really slacking. I have Virginia Tech in this one as well. Friday night game, we have a great matchup actually between Boston College and Miami. Both of these teams coming off bye weeks. We really don't know what we're going to see out of these teams just because they've kind of been wild cards this year. Miami looked great for a few weeks. N'Kosi Perry was looking really good. And then they looked awful against UVA. They lose 16-13. Their quarterback gets benched. And then Mark Richt even says Roser is going to start against Boston College. And he said that before their bye week even started, which is crazy. And then we see on the Boston College side of the ball, they're really good at running the football. Passing game decent, but not great. And I'm going to have to go with Miami in this football game, going with the away team. I honestly would love to see Boston College win. I'm going to go with Miami.
Yeah, I think for me the big thing is the bye week for Miami. I think having that extra time to prepare is huge. I know that Boston College is also coming off a bye week, but I don't know. I think that, this is the way I look at this game. Rozier has a chance to kind of reestablish himself. Now, we talked a little bit about this. I don't necessarily agree with the decision to bench Perry after the first sign of trouble in that game against UVA, but I get it. I understand they've decided to move back to Rozier. So if he's your guy, he's got those reps with the ones, had a chance to reestablish himself in practice, and I think he's going to come out with a renewed sense of leadership with that team. I think the team rallies around him. I still think Perry is the better quarterback, the better option, but listen, Richt made a decision, and I'm going to go with Miami as well. I think they get it done against, a Boston College team that has played decent but not great. And that loss to Purdue is definitely not looking as bad as it was earlier in the season. But, yeah, I'm going with the Hurricanes.
Yeah, Purdue lost 3 games by 8 combined points. In 2 of those games, they had personal foul penalties to basically end the game while they're on defense. While they stopped the other team on third down, penalty. And it's amazing because they even lost one of those games to Eastern Michigan. And then they beat Boston College, and everyone's saying, wow, BC was ranked. They shouldn't have been ranked. You know what? Like you just said, Purdue's looking pretty good right now after thumping Ohio State last weekend. Jeff Brom's got those guys playing great. So Boston College is sitting at 5-2, 2-1 in conference. Miami's the exact same. So coming out of this game, we're going to see a 6-2 team, and either in one division or the other. So we'll see if the Coastal comes out with more winning teams or the Atlantic does. And that's going to lead to a question I have for you later, a topical question for sure. But moving to Saturday, noon, ABC, number 2 Clemson travels to Florida State University. And Florida State's going to win this game, right, Ken?
I can't wait to see where Florida State ends up ranked in the playoff rankings after we destroy Clemson at home. It's going to be, I think it's going to be that's a topic we should discuss. But no, I'm kidding. It's funny. Last year we had no business being in the game, and we had a chance to win late in the fourth quarter. So, things can happen, obviously, but so I will say this: I think that Jimbo was a better manager of big games, at least so far that I've seen. I guess it's unfair to say that because we've had such a small sample size of Taggart's time here, but I'm going with Clemson in this one. I think you are too. That defensive line is just going to destroy. You quite possibly have the best defensive line in the country going against probably the worst offensive line in the country. You put that together, and it does not equal good things for the Noles.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be an interesting game to see where Florida State's at. We've seen them get back on track the last couple of weeks and look better, but it's going to be a different animal against Clemson. And Clemson's kind of on a roll. Maybe it's a trap game. Florida State has a lot of talent that's just figuring out how to fit into the system. Maybe this is the week when it all comes together. Who knows? But I definitely have Clemson. I'm going to go with the safe pick. I'm not going to be crazy here like I am with some of my other picks possibly coming up. Definitely have Clemson at noon. Another noon game that we have on the ACC network, which, by the way, I love how the ACC network has noon, 12:20 and 12:30 as start times. Very good. So the ACC, it's so you can stagger, the commercial breaks and everything, right?
Right, of course. Yeah.
But at Cardinal Stadium, Louisville, Kentucky, we see a great matchup between Wake Forest and Louisville. And I have to tell you, this is a highlight game of my week. Why? because one of these teams is finally going to get their first ACC win. And you know what? I'm just going to give a round of applause right now to that team. You've been awful all year, and your stadium's been empty because people don't want to watch your team play awfully. But you know what? After this week, one of you is going to say you've won a game. And you know what, Ken? I went back and forth on this one in the 10 seconds I picked it right now, and I wasn't sure Louisville Wake Forest. I thought, man, Louisville's defense with Brian Van Gorder is so bad. And then I thought of Wake Forest, and they don't even have a defensive coordinator. So it's just really tough to pick because both teams are so bad. I'm going to go with Wake Forest. Why not? I mean, Louisville's offense is in shambles. Wake Forest is only in half shambles and like half okay. Got to go with Wake for me, man. Who do you have at noon?
Oh, this is interesting. I'm going to go with Louisville. And I know I said earlier that Louisville may not win an ACC game. I think this is the one that they do get. I think it will be the only one, quite honestly. But, for me, listen, Wake Forest, they've run a lot of plays. They ran over 100 plays against Florida State in this last week's game.
Which is incredible.
It's incredible. Yeah, it's amazing. The way they run their offense, it's fast-paced. They take short yards here and there. They really work for their yards, but unfortunately, they don't get a great point-to-play ratio. And I will say this: the reason I'm going with Louisville is if they can put it together, which is I know is a big if, and they haven't been able to do it this year. You're looking at one of the better offensive minds in college football going against really no defensive coordinator. And so for me, that's what kind of tips the scales towards the Cardinals. It's definitely not a confident pick, but I'm going to go with Bobby Petrino and the Louisville Cardinals this game.
I actually am thinking more and more that Petrino is not one of the better offensive minds in football from what I have seen. But that's a whole nother situation. Speaking of running over 100 plays, total random tangent, which is what the whole point of our new topical podcast is. I saw the other day that when Baker Mayfield and Mahomes played against each other in college back in 2016, did you see this stat, man?
Yes.
They each threw for 7 touchdowns. Mahomes threw for 734 yards. He was 52 of 88. He had 88 pass attempts in a game. That's just ridiculous. And Baker Mayfield had a casual 27 out of 36 for 545 yards, 7 touchdowns. But could you imagine 7 out of 27 passes that Baker Mayfield threw in that game ended up being touchdowns? I mean, I would love to throw for a touchdown in 25% of passes I throw.
Guys, I know we talk about ACC football, and I know a lot of listeners don't watch NFL football, but man, if you ever get a chance to watch Patrick Mahomes play, you should definitely check out the Chiefs here in the next couple weeks. They're playing great.
But even more importantly, if you have a chance to listen to Patrick Mahomes, you should just listen to him talk because it's magical.
Yeah, first watch highlight. Like, just go to YouTube and look up highlights of Patrick Mahomes, and then look up an interview with him, and you'll just laugh your freaking head off. It's incredible. It's
he's as someone put it the other day, he sounds like Kermit the Frog, and they're not too far off with that.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving on to our next game. This is a 12:20 game, so it's a little bit different than the noon games. Don't be fooled. This one happens at Scott Stadium in Charlottesville, Virginia. UNC goes to play Virginia. This game is known as the South's oldest rivalry. Not actually the oldest rivalry in the South. The Deep South's oldest rivalry between Auburn and Georgia is technically a couple of months older, which is kind of ridiculous. However, it's called the South's oldest rivalry. They've played 122 times. It's the second most played rivalry in Division I football after Paul Bunyan's Axe, which is Wisconsin and Minnesota up in the Big Ten. So pretty big game here. We saw Virginia win this game last year by 6 points. North Carolina leads the all-time series here, but Virginia's riding high right now, man. They had a great victory last weekend. They had a great victory the weekend before that. They're playing really good football. UNC, on the other hand, looks, pretty awful. UNC is sitting at the bottom of the Coastal. They have 1 win and 3 losses in conference, 1 win and 5 losses overall. Does not look good. But I'm going to go with UNC because what the heck? Why not? they've actually looked half decent the last 2 weekends against Virginia Tech and against Syracuse. They just haven't been able to seal the deal. And UVA has looked really good, and I'm actually really worried about them as a Virginia Tech fan. I've thought all year that they were going to beat Virginia Tech this November, which is why I'm selling my tickets to that game and don't want to go. But I'm going to go with UNC because why not do something ridiculous? I have a 3-game cushion. I can play around a little bit. How about that?
Oh man, just throw it in my face. Throw it in my face. No. I think everything says pick UVA, right? Because, if you look at it, they've come off 2 great wins back to back. They're trending upwards. You look on the flip side of things, UNC, like you said, they're trending down. They've had 2 really close games that they've lost both of those games. One was double overtime last week to Syracuse. And so you say to yourself, oh, well, of course, UVA should win, and then, UNC's not. I'm actually gonna go with you, man, because I think the way this season has gone in the ACC, you just expect something weird to happen. This season has not followed, any trends that you might think are going to be, continuing week to week to week. So I'm going to go with the Tar Heels as well. Think about where we've come from, early in the season talking about Larry Fedora being fired, and that still could be the case. But, thinking that they might get this win against a really good, you might even argue that besides Clemson, UVA is one of the hottest teams in the ACC right now. So yeah, but I'm going to, the ACC, man, it's the poor man's SEC. So there's going to be parity. I'm going to go with the Tar Heels.
If we don't get hate mail from UVA fans this week, I will be really disappointed. I mean, they're playing great right now. We both just picked against them. We've bashed them this year. We better get some hate mail, but you are going to go with me. You're going to go against their perfect 4-0 mark at home that UVA has. Also, I don't know if you knew this, Ken. UVA has the second longest winning streak in the ACC at 2 games. So that's really sad.
That's what I'm talking about, man. That's what I'm saying.
There's only 6 teams in the ACC that are on win streaks right now. 4 of them are on a 1-game win streak. So, Clemson is on a 7-game streak, UVA on a 2-game, and everyone else, no. So, you're right when you said UVA's the other hot team. But we're both going to go against them. Wow, that's crazy. I did not expect you to do that. I didn't expect me to even do that. So, you know what? Why not?
It's the way this season's going, man. It's the way it's going.
I almost wish I picked like this, with like the Duke game last weekend. Who knows? But moving on to the next one, 3:30, another ACC network game here. We have Duke visiting Pittsburgh up at, as my buddy always called it, the ketchup dump, known as Heinz Field. Duke and Pittsburgh. So this is a tough one for me to pick because Pittsburgh, I know they're sitting at 3 wins, 4 losses. But they're 3-1 at home. For some reason, people struggle to play in Pittsburgh. Not really sure why. Pittsburgh has really done a good job rebounding lately. They looked so bad earlier this season, like completely awful. And then they almost beat Notre Dame the last time they were on the field. They were up in South Bend on the 13th. They've had a bye week now, but they only lost by 5 points. Really close game. This is a team that beat Syracuse a couple weeks ago. But then besides that, it's not pretty. They lost to UNC. That's UNC's only win this year. They got blown out by UCF. They got blown out by Penn State. Is Pittsburgh a good team or not? The last 2 times we've seen them on the field, they've been good. Where on the other hand, I'm just really, really unsure what to look for Duke. Duke looked good. Virginia Tech beat him by 14. Then Duke looked okay again. Then UVA beat him by 14. I'm going to have to go with Pittsburgh in this. I know it's a bit of an upset. Duke's sitting at 5-2, Pittsburgh only at 3-4. It's just hard to play up there at Heinz Field. And Pat Narduzzi, as much as I don't like him, his guys are emotional. They're scrappy. Let's go with Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I think these last 2 games are pretty hard to pick. This game and then the NC State-Syracuse game, which we'll talk about last. But, it's funny. I really agree with most of what you said about Pitt. They looked really good against, Notre Dame the week before last, which is, Notre Dame's one of those teams where we talked about, they kind of play down to their competition. So I don't really know what to glean from that win against Pitt. And then they had a great offensive output against Syracuse in a shootout the week before that. So it is hard to play up there, Heinz Field. But you know what? I think that I'm going with Duke on the rebound game this week. I think that in a disappointing loss to Virginia, they're going to want some just really just revenge and just trying to prove to themselves that they're still a good team. And I think for Daniel Jones, a lot of guys, I saw actually recently that CBS Sports has him going as, I think, the number 2 overall pick in the draft.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a little high, but still, he's a great quarterback, and I think he needs to show it. So, I think that Cutcliffe is going to challenge his guys to really put in the preparation this week. Tough to rebound when it's after a loss in division like that, but this is a big game for them. They need this win in their division, so I'm going to go with the Duke Blue Devils.
This next game is impossible to pick. Definitely the closest game of the week. The spread is 2 points in favor of NC State. This game is 49% to 51%. So what the matchup predictor shows. It's at Syracuse, obviously hard to play up there at the Dome. We see 2 veteran quarterbacks, Dungy and Finley. Of course, as you brought up earlier, is Dungy the guy? Who really knows? But their numbers are relatively similar this year between those two. 10 touchdowns each, 5 picks for Finley, 4 for Dungy. Man, I'm struggling with this game because both teams, like you said, the parity in the ACC is so huge this year. Syracuse has lost 2 games, right? They're sitting at 5-2. Those 2 games were a 4-point loss at Clemson in a game they probably should have won, and then a Pittsburgh overtime loss, and then they won in 2 overtimes against an awful UNC team last week. So I'm sitting here scratching my head thinking, who is the Syracuse team? Who are they for real? Like, they barely lose to number 2 in the country, but then they lost to Pittsburgh. They struggled with UNC. And then on the other side of the ball, we see NC State, who we really haven't seen play tough opponents, but back on the 29th of September, they beat UVA by 2 touchdowns. They beat Boston College earlier this month by, 5 points. And you're thinking, oh, North Carolina State could be okay. But what I saw last weekend out of them at Clemson, 41-7, completely blown out. I think NC State was kind of exposed in that game. I actually had picked NC State originally when I just jotted down some notes here. I'm going to go with Syracuse. Just because I want to see, I don't know, Syracuse just does not seem like a football power to me. I know they have a national championship back in 1959 or something, but they are not a traditional power. I would love to see them riding at 6-2 with a close loss to Clemson. That would make them look pretty good. They might be able to move back in the rankings. And NC State just disappointed me so much last week, and I almost don't even want to see them play this week. I'm going to go with Syracuse. I'm going to change it.
Yeah, man. I actually had Syracuse as well, and I think for me it's going to be interesting. Babers came out after the game and said that the change to Tommy DeVito is not permanent. He then said in his press conference earlier this week that basically he was going to make the NC State defense prepare for both quarterbacks, so he's not going to announce who's going to get the start until closer to the game. Honestly, it's interesting. We love Eric Dungy. We think he's a great quarterback, but it's interesting. This team seems to get a little lift, at least in the passing game, from DeVito. And I'm not so sure that we might see both of them get significant playing time in different roles. Honestly, you look at Dungy as maybe more of the just the battering ram and someone they might use more in run packages. And DeVito seems to have a little bit better arm, at least from the limited time that I've seen both of them. I think if DeVito gets the start, then it's going to be a win for Syracuse. If Dungy gets the start, I think it could still be a win for Syracuse. But I actually like DeVito in this situation a little bit better. So I'm going to go with Syracuse as well. I think that NC State, since they didn't have that game against West Virginia, like you said earlier, and then they just got destroyed by Clemson, it was never even a game. Yeah, I think they were exposed a little bit. And, you have to wonder, do they rebound after a tough loss against a superior team, or do they just kind of get down on themselves a little bit and have a lack of confidence going up to the Carrier Dome? So I think it's not a recipe for great confidence going to another away game at a hard place to play. So I'm going to go with Syracuse.
Not a lot of night games in the Carrier Dome. So it'll be interesting to see a 7 p.m. kick there, ESPN2. It could be an upset. We both picked technically the upset because NC State's number 22 right now. So there we go. We ran through all that really, really fast. All the different games, our picks. We're going to get to see Ian pull out another couple of games ahead of Ken after this weekend.
Wow.
No, just kidding.
Wow.
But this is a really exciting time for us because Ken and I have so many things we want to talk about. Some we're definitely saving for the offseason, like conference realignment, different things like that. But there's a few fun topics that Ken and I really want to put out there. And my first one that I'd like to propose to you, Ken, is this. What is going on in the AP poll, man? What are these guys looking for? It's every year it seems like it gets worse, in my opinion. And maybe that's because the writers know it doesn't matter anymore. They know that, the playoff teams will be selected. They have no say in that. And that they're going to have to pick the person who wins the national championship game. So in reality, the AP poll writers know that their vote doesn't matter. And there was even one pollster who was trolling, I think, Alabama last week. Because he had picked Ohio State as his number one, and he was like, I'll never vote for Alabama, they're awful. And finally he did this week. But I don't know why. It seems every year this poll gets worse and worse and worse. We see teams like Washington State not even ranked, even though they had a great record, and they're blowing out teams. And then they have one solid win last weekend over Oregon. They jump 11 spots from barely being ranked at number 25 all the way up to 14. And I don't know, just some of what I've seen in the poll is just absolutely ridiculous. And kind of where I want to jump off on is the ACC has two teams that are ranked right now. 5-1 NC State is number 22 after falling 6 spots. Clemson's sitting up there at number 2. Only 2 teams in the entire poll. It doesn't look good for the conference. And if we're honest about it, and we've talked about this before, it's definitely been a year of parity in the conference. But when you look at the SEC, for example, they have the same parity, they have very similar win-loss records, and yet they have tons of teams ranked. I mean, they have Alabama at 1, deservedly so. LSU at the losses at 4. They're the number 1 one-loss team, which is very interesting to me because, when you look at LSU's schedule this year, their loss was to Florida. Florida's number 9. But look at Michigan. Michigan's ranked behind them, and Michigan's loss was to number 3. So why is Michigan not above LSU? Michigan's loss was to a team ranked 6 spots higher than LSU's loss. That's odd. Georgia's sitting at number 7. They have a loss. Florida's at number 9. They have a loss, and they didn't look pretty in one of their other games. Kentucky's at number 12 with the loss. It's just amazing how the SEC beats each other, and they're ranked highly. Texas A&M at 16, which I actually think that one's deservedly so. Their 2 losses being Alabama and Clemson, right? Number 1, number 2. That one actually makes sense to me. But really, when you just look at the whole poll, I don't get why the ACC isn't treated, I guess, equally. And then also, we have, it makes sense. Our 2 teams with the best win-loss record are ranked. But the ones that really do bother me are Virginia. We just saw UEA. I know they're at 5-2. And I know their 2 losses maybe aren't the best. They lost that 20-16 game against IU. Of course, we saw IU nearly knock off Penn State this weekend. But then we saw Virginia. They beat number 16 Miami. And then they go ahead and they beat a 5-1 Duke team. And they barely get any votes in the poll. And just one last thing, the thing that really bothers me about that in particular is when LSU beats Miami, LSU moves up in the poll. When Virginia beats Miami, Miami just moves out of the poll. It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so you talked about a lot there. So I'm going to kind of break it down a little bit. If you're addressing just the 2 teams in the ACC and where they're ranked right now, I think, obviously, like you mentioned, it comes down to win-losses, right? Like, it comes down to the record. Unfortunately, I don't think that's actually a reflection of the 2 best teams in our conference. Of course, Clemson deserves to be in the probably top 10. Well, we'll get into that later. But they deserve to be basically where they are. I do think that there are 2 or 3 teams that are better than NC State, all in the Coastal, actually. But they have not quite as good of a record. Now, partly that's because NC State got lucky with that hurricane earlier, and they didn't have to play West Virginia. But that's another issue. And then when you talk about, we've talked a little bit about this, but the ACC versus the SEC and why the conference perception is so vastly different, even though really the parity is similar within each conference and the win-loss records are similar in each conference. It all goes back to me at least, the blue bloods of college football. If you look at the conferences, the ACC has teams like Duke, like Virginia, like UNC, like Georgia Tech. Teams that for pretty much a large part of college football history just haven't been great. You think about it back in especially like the 90s. They were really just like horrible. Those teams. Syracuse doesn't have a great,
except for Georgia Tech, of course. They won that national championship, tied with Colorado, right?
They've had some good years, but you don't, at least perennially, don't look at them as a team to be reckoned with. And then you look at teams like Syracuse and Louisville, teams that really have kind of really only started to grow their football programs in the last 25 years, as really putting a lot of money into them and that kind of thing, investing in facilities. And then you contrast that with teams like Georgia, like Auburn, like LSU, like Florida. Just really, you think about these teams have been around for so long. They've been really good teams for a long time as well. If you look back, starting back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they've had good teams. And so I think what you're dealing with here, you're not just dealing with, oh, well, the ACC doesn't get as much respect as the SEC. Really, it's the ACC doesn't get as much respect as most of the conferences. I could include the Big Ten in this too. I mean, I think there's a lot of that. Michigan's been around forever. They've had great teams in the past. Now, I think that still holds weight, unfortunately. Now even. So if you look at and then that affects the teams that they play, because then people say, well, Northwestern barely almost beat Michigan. Northwestern must be pretty good. But then if you contrast a Northwestern team with, say, like a UVA team, well, I'm not so sure that UVA might beat them on a neutral field. So, but the country doesn't see it like that. So I think that's what we're dealing with here. The ACC, it's a little hard right now. Obviously the Florida States of the world, the Miamis, they have that pedigree. I guess you could say Clemson has earned that pedigree in the last really decade, I would say. They've really become a powerhouse, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me on that. But I think that's basically kind of what we're up against right now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And really, if you look at the rankings, it's just difficult. You see a team like Stanford re-enters the polls after, getting really beat up by Notre Dame, beat up by Utah. But, now we see Utah is actually being ranked, so maybe Stanford should be. It's just a lot of questions about these two lost teams. And are there any really good two lost teams? You mentioned the whole Northwestern thing versus UVA. Of course, we saw Northwestern play an ACC team this year, and we saw Duke beat them by 2 touchdowns at Northwestern, and they didn't even have their starting quarterback for half that game. Duke didn't. So definitely interesting. I think the conference did get hurt a little bit with, Georgia Tech lost to South Florida, for example. Obviously, that kind of happened with the 2 kickoff returns, killed them. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with the conference. Really young is what the ACC's issue is now.
Yeah.
Definitely a down year because there's so much youth that's being played. I mean, we're talking about Trevor Lawrence, a true freshman quarterback, but, we see all these other teams like Virginia Tech we talked about. 80-something% of their 2 deep are freshmen and sophomores. There's a lot of youth at Florida State in certain positions. Just a lot of graduations that have moved people on. Really, the only teams with a lot of age and experience are certain positions at NC State, like quarterback, and a couple of positions maybe at Syracuse have age. But really, a lot of these other teams are super young. Boston College is very young. They're just going to keep getting better. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I know last year, the ACC, and the year before that, the ACC looked really, really good. Their out-of-conference record was great. Their bowl record 2 years ago was fantastic. They blew the doors off everyone. They beat the SEC in almost every game they played against them, including the national championship game 2 years ago. So definitely looking for the ACC getting back to that. It's just, I know it's hard to rank teams, but sometimes it's a little ridiculous when you have all these 2 lost teams and they're all SEC teams. Last, a couple weeks ago when Auburn and A&M and all these teams are ranked, just seems a little bit one-sided. But moving on to our next topic here, Mr. Ken. There's a lot of good stuff going on in the ACC, a lot of good building, but Clemson is the main dog. I mean, we all know that. They're the main dog.
Right.
And the question is, are they on par with the leaders of other conferences? And this is when you bounced around this question. I thought it was fascinating. Are they on par with other conferences? Could they beat Alabama?
Yeah, there's a lot in this question as well, and I think it's interesting, right? Because of course, the last 4 years, really, Clemson's been great. They've been the class of the conference. They've represented us well, beating Alabama 3 years ago, having great battles with Alabama pretty much the last 3 years. Gosh, I hope we don't see them play again, though. Honestly, I'm really getting tired of that. But I do think that this year is interesting to me. Clemson has played some tough games. They played that game against Texas A&M, got the win. Um, but honestly, and we mentioned this a couple weeks ago. They're not going to really be tested probably until the postseason, and that includes post ACC championship game. And we even talked about maybe they don't even get in. Now I think that where they're positioned right now, I think they would get in. It's going to be really interesting to see, assuming they take care of business against Florida State this week, where the playoff committee ranks them, because I don't know if they're the second best team in the country right now. I think that it's easy to put them there right now because you would have to have discussions about, well, this other team has losses, but Clemson doesn't. They're undefeated, so of course they should be number 2. And I get that. Listen, I understand resume. I understand the reasonings. You play the games to win. I get it. But, Michigan's playing great football right now. A lot of some of the teams that we mentioned that talked about in the SEC are playing well. I'm not so sure that Clemson is the second best team in the country. But the question is, how do they stack up against some of the other leaders in the conference? If we're going straight to Alabama, I don't really see anyone beating Alabama this year. I mean, they've had some injuries at quarterback. Jalen reportedly had a little foot issue. He had to have some, he had some minor surgery, but he appears to be okay. I don't know. I don't think he'll be in action the next couple weeks. And then Tua had I think a knee sprain, but obviously he looked great in this game this last week. So I think that no one really poses a big threat to them unless something does happen to Tua. I think then they would be a little more vulnerable. But I think even that defense that Clemson has, which is a great defense, by far the best defensive line in the country, I think even they would have trouble against Tua because really the weakness in that defense is the secondary. Not that they're bad, but they're just not as good as the defensive line is. And so I think Tua would be able to – he's so accurate. I think he would be able to pick them apart. I think a really fascinating match, and we saw this matchup I think 2 or 3 years ago, was it Oklahoma versus Clemson. I think that would be a really interesting game. And then, maybe even Texas, Texas beating Oklahoma recently. I'm still, the verdict's a little bit out on them. They gave up that really ugly win to Maryland early in the season, but they played really well midway through the midway point. So I think they'll be pretty highly ranked when the playoff committee comes out. But I mean, do you see Clemson as the number 2 team? I mean, how do you think they stack up against some of these other, like if they were to play a Georgia right now, or if they were to play an LSU, how do you think they would fare in that matchup?
So one conference you didn't mention is the Big Ten. I would actually love to see Clemson play Michigan. Seeing Don Brown's defense at Michigan go up against a spread attack with a good quarterback. I would love to absolutely see that. I'd also like to see Michigan's offense, which is evolved this year for sure, that he's finally done with Shea Patterson, like you and I talked game 1, open it up a little bit, be a little bit of a Kaepernick style offense. They've done that. Michigan will go from 3 tight end sets with a fullback to pound the ball, and on the next play they'll go 5 wide. I think that's really cool. I'd love to see that up against Clemson's defensive line because if they can't run the ball, it'd be interesting to see if Shea Patterson could run the ball. He's really good legs. Or if he could just, get it over the top of the Clemson defense. I'd love to see that matchup. You mentioned Texas. Yeah, Texas, Oklahoma, they're going to, if the season keeps up and they keep winning, they'll face off against each other. West Virginia, obviously, still in the mix there. But 2 of those 3 teams will face off against each other in the Big 12 championship game. But Texas has not looked super impressive to me. They beat K-State by 5. I know they beat Oklahoma. That was an amazing, crazy back and forth game. Texas took a big lead, then Oklahoma came back. But then we see them barely sneak one out against Baylor a couple weeks ago. I'm just still unsold on Texas. I think Clemson would beat up on Texas, no problem. Oklahoma, though, that offense, Lincoln Riley is the best offensive guy in college football right now, hands down, in my opinion. And,
yep.
Okay, and way better than Petrino. Ugh. Yeah. And No, but seriously, Lincoln Riley's the man, and he would tear apart Clemson's defense. Obviously, Clemson's defense would do a good job of minimizing damage. They wouldn't give up 60-something like some of Oklahoma's opponents do. But, their offense is better than Clemson's, but their defense is nowhere near good enough. I think Clemson beat them too. Alabama, while they have looked great this year, there's always the question mark about playing a full game. I mean, Alabama has not had to play more than 3 quarters. And as you said, Tua, he looked great this week, but he got hurt, a knee sprain, and he left the game. And then we saw Hurts come in, and he left the game with an injury and ankle. So really interesting to see what happens with Alabama there. They have weaknesses on that team. Their defense has weaknesses. They've given up a decent amount of points to a few teams this year. I think Clemson could exploit that and score points. It's going to really come down to, can Clemson's defense stop Tua? Because I think Clemson can put up points in Alabama. I think Clemson's defense is better than Alabama's. So the real question is going to be if Clemson's defense can truly contain him. And then the team you haven't mentioned. So I basically said Clemson can beat every conference except Alabama would be a game, but I hope it's not. I hope they both lose in the semifinals or something. But Notre Dame is the other question mark there. Clemson Notre Dame would be a fascinating game because Notre Dame has played so well under Ian Book here, minus the Pittsburgh game. But I'd have to go with Clemson in that one over Notre Dame. So I guess what I'm saying is I think Clemson can honestly beat any of these teams. But as you know, with a team that has a great high-flying offense, one off week makes you look awful. And we've seen that in college football a few times where a team like Ohio State this weekend, who could cover up so many flaws with a great offense, has a bad week, it falls apart.
Oh, man. Also, real quick on that game, if you guys didn't get to see that game, first of all, it was basically a mirror image of when Ohio State got smacked by Iowa a couple years ago.
Iowa, yeah.
Oh, loved it. But if you guys haven't seen Rondale Moore play for Purdue, you guys need to go check that guy out. He's a true freshman, basically a Swiss Army knife. He returns punts for them, kickoffs. He does, the whole jet sweep thing. He's a slot receiver out wide. But he's incredible. He runs like a 4.3 40. He's like 5'9", but super quick, super like big twitch athlete. And if you guys haven't seen him play, you definitely should check him out. But basically, I've got a little chart here in front of me. Someone posted what they think is it's an Instagram account that we follow called College Rivals. Go give them a shout out. Go give them a follow. It's a really funny account, actually. Just basically people send in hate mail to their rival schools, and he posts them. But he posts a kind of a power ranking every week, and right now he's got Clemson as number 1 in the ACC, Texas number 1 in the Big 12, Michigan number 1 in the Big 10, Washington State as the leader in the Pac-12, and then of course Alabama in the SEC. If you're looking at that, I think that Clemson could beat everyone except Alabama. Like you said, it would be a game. But I will say this, Michigan has, as much as we, dog on Harbaugh, Michigan's really impressed me lately. Like you said, they kind of unleashed Patterson, molded the offense a little more in his image. And so I do think that would be a great game. Let me ask you this, too, while we're kind of talking about comparing teams. Clemson has a great defense. Rank these defenses for me worst to best, okay? So, actually, let's go best to worst. So, between these defenses, Clemson, Michigan, Alabama, LSU, and Georgia.
Wow, 3 SECs, dude. So you didn't pick a Big 12 team. I'm very confused. I knew you'd like that. No, yeah, I actually have the same graphic here, which is great. Really interesting for some of the teams how he picked. And also, they only ranked the top 10, so some schools didn't even get in the poll. Great for Washington State being ranked number 1 in the pack. That's actually a team that would be fascinating to see play against Clemson because Mike Leach is just crazy. I obviously talked about him quite a bit the last podcast and how much I love him. He could probably pull something off and beat Clemson. I mean, I almost think he has a better shot than some of these other teams. You mentioned Michigan. I will say this. I live in Michigan country. I watched the game on Saturday. Of all the college football I watch, some of the most painful is probably the MAC, in my opinion. Like, it's kind of painful to just watch the MAC. But if it's Tuesday night MACtion, I'll put it on because it's decent.
MACtion, yeah. Sure, yeah.
But of all the teams I watch, the most painful Power 5 team is Michigan. Hands down, no question. Their games are just like pulling teeth. Like, they're not boring. Like, you're still interested, so you have to watch. But it's so unexciting and like, I don't know. It's just, Michigan football is awful to watch. And they made so many mistakes on Saturday. They should have won that game by a lot more. They held Michigan State to under 100 yards of offense. It's crazy, but they kept making mistake after mistake. They should have blown them out by 20-something points at least. Michigan is so frustrating, and I understand Harbaugh's position. If you have a defense that is that good, why take chances on offense? But the offense still made mistakes, right? Like, if you're being super conservative on offense, I can get it, okay? You know, be conservative, let the defense win. But if you're still out there making mistakes and fumbling the ball and just... Michigan football is beyond frustrating. I do love how we've all of a sudden seen a change where Michigan is now number 1 in the Big Ten power rankings, and we see teams like Wisconsin and Penn State falling down, and Iowa is now number 3. I just think that's amazing. To answer your defense question, I was so impressed by what I saw out of Don Brown's crew this weekend. Absolutely fantastic. Sideline to sideline speed blew me away. It's basically minus the first half against, or the first quarter against Notre Dame and the first half against Northwestern. Michigan's defense has given up basically nothing. It's been incredibly impressive. Alabama, on the other hand, as I said, I've seen weaknesses in them. Georgia, their defense looks good, maybe not great. I'd struggle to rank LSU versus Georgia defensively. I'm going to have to go with LSU's better than Georgia.
Yeah,
so I'll give you that one.
Yep.
I think LSU's defense is better than Alabama's right now.
Yes, I agree.
But you see, it's hard to answer that because Alabama's offense scores points so fast. Their defense has been on the field almost twice as much as LSU's has been on the field, right? So LSU's offense is awful, but at least they take some clock out. It's just a little difficult here. Michigan's defense is incredible, but I will say this. And I had this thought this weekend watching Big Ten football and thinking how gritty and boring it was, is Michigan doesn't play the kind of offense as some of these other teams do.
Good point.
I mean, Clemson probably plays way harder offenses week in and week out in the ACC.
Definitely more diverse offenses, I would say.
Absolutely. Diverse. They've seen the triple option. They've seen the spread. They've seen pro style. Michigan, honestly, Michigan State is a team that's good, but they're not that great this year. I know they pulled out a couple of trick plays, which you guys should watch. They ran the Philly special for their touchdown, by the way, this weekend, and they lost 21-7. And they had a trick play touchdown against Penn State last weekend, so just kind of funny. And Duke had a trick play touchdown this weekend, too, if you didn't see that. But yeah, so Clemson just plays a lot harder offenses. But I don't trust the back end of Clemson. Their front end's good. I don't trust their back end. Overall, I'm going to say... I can't say Michigan. I can't, just because I live here. I'm going to say LSU's number 1, Michigan's number 2, Clemson's number 3, Georgia's 4, Alabama's 5.
Oh, okay. I'd probably switch Alabama and Georgia, but I have my top 3 are exactly the same. And really, I wanted to get you to that place where basically I think LSU's defense is by far the best defense in the country. They've got, I think, 4 or 5 guys that are predicted to go in the first couple rounds of the draft this coming year if they all leave. So yeah, I think that defense is loaded. I think they have star athletes at each level of the defense. I think any great defense, you've got to have a great secondary player, got to have a great linebacker, and you've got to have a great D lineman. And they have all those things. So yeah, I think by far LSU is the best defense in the country.
Okay, couple quick ones for you, just to close it out. These are 2 questions that you created, so I just want to hear your thoughts on them, man. Number 1, who do you want to see as the new head coach of Louisville if Petrino gets fired? What you got?
You know, there was a mailbag question when I did my solo podcast a couple weeks ago, and it was dealing with Fedora. And so I kind of addressed some things, just kind of telling people that, for me, myself, like I like to keep track of, I both like to keep track of, the up and coming coaches in the game, who's trending upwards and might be jumping to a better job in the future. The problem is, and I hate to keep ragging on Louisville, but I'm going to, it's not necessarily a destination job. I mean, Petrino, he is even there just because things went south and there was a scandal at Arkansas. Which, by the way, I heard that there's rumor that there might be another scandal right now at Louisville. I don't know the exact nature of it, but we'll have to see what that actually plays out as because I don't want to speculate right now. But if you're asking me who I think I would like to see there, I would think that maybe they would want to go more defensive-minded coach. I said this for Fedora, and I'll say it here for Petrino. I think his name's Jimmy Lake. He's the defensive coordinator at Washington. I think is a great defensive coach. I don't, however, think that he would come to University of Louisville. I think that's like a step down, even from the defensive coordinator position at Washington. So, and I think he would probably, his connections I think are more on the West Coast with high school coaches and that kind of thing. If they went more offensive, you could maybe say maybe a Mike Norvell at Memphis. He was kind of a hot coach last year. Some teams went after him. I think he runs a good scheme there. I think he's got a well-coached team. Would be able to recruit a little higher level of athlete at University of Louisville. Think of Lamar Jackson in a spread option offense that he runs. That would be incredible. I think that the Matt Campbells of the world, the Matt Canadas, we both like both of them. But I think that again, some of these guys are a little too big for that job. So it's actually kind of a tricky question to look at people and say, all right, you're a good up and coming coach, but you're not so big and up and coming that you can, overlook Louisville. You know what I mean? I don't know. What do you think? Is there anyone that on your radar that you kind of think that would be a good fit if Petrino were to get fired this year?
My first thought is he probably won't because he's a $14 million buyout. Okay. But as we know, they have a lot of money there at Louisville in their athletic department because of Papa John's and because of Yum Brands, So it's going to be very interesting to see if they want to pay that money or not. There's a couple of decent coaches out there, but we must remember this is a bad year for them. And I know Lamar Jackson was probably why they looked good. But he has a record at Louisville of .706 winning percentage. That's pretty dang good, man, to win 70% of your games. And I know it's a down year now, and that's over two, obviously you said the Arkansas thing and coming back. Maybe they keep him around. It is a young team. Maybe they think, he can turn it around. I've seen a lot of people say they're going to try to go after Jeff Brom, which I think's hilarious because why would you leave Purdue? I'd rather be at Purdue than Louisville. It's a personal question. The academics are, in my opinion, better in certain ways, and the school has a lot of lore being there in the Big Ten. Plus, it's the Big Ten West, which is super winnable. So I don't understand why he would ever want to leave. Obviously, if crazy stuff goes on at some other schools, dominoes can fall. But I think Petrino would get fired if he didn't have the big buyout. I think they're going to be patient with him because they're good at basketball. Because they're good at another sport, they can be patient for a year. If this was a football-only type of school, they'd be less patient. So moving on to the next one, we're going to look at Florida real quick. And this is our last topic before we cut out. But we're going to look at Florida real quick. They have a team ranked number 9, University of Florida out of Gainesville. They have a team ranked number 10, UCF out of the Orlando area. And they have South Florida sitting there at number 21 out of the Tampa area. That's 3 Florida teams that are ranked. Obviously, we saw Florida State start the season ranked, fall out. They're doing better now, but still not particularly great, sitting there at 4-3. But they're 3-1 at home now. So things are slowly turning. If you look at the rest of Florida State's schedule, though, 6 games left. They play 4 top 25 teams, 3 teams ranked in the top 10, and 2 top 5 teams in Clemson at number 2, Notre Dame at number 3. One of those home, one of those away. That's a really difficult schedule.
It's
I know Florida State needs 2 more wins to pull into keeping their bowl streak alive, albeit unofficial. It's a real thing. So definitely important for them to do. I know last year it was real close to losing that, but man, there's 2 ways to think about this. Number one, are they relevant anymore? If they lose these games, are they gonna fall apart? Or flip it the other way. maybe they have a chance for an upset. When you finish your season with that many good teams, you're bound to beat one of them, right? And before you go and talk about your favorite team, because you know a lot about them, Florida State currently has the #1 recruiting class in the ACC for this coming year. So another important thing to look at as we look at the future of Florida State football.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the short term, you're absolutely right. I think with that volume of high-profile games, you're bound to pull out an upset in one of those games. If you ask me, between the top 10 teams that we're going to play, if Florida continues to be, top 10, if they beat Georgia this weekend, if Notre Dame keeps winning, if Clemson keeps, obviously they'll play Clemson this week, but I don't think they'll beat Clemson. But I think they could split Florida and Notre Dame. I actually think that they'll give Notre Dame a great game. I think that Notre Dame is, of the three teams, I think that they're the ones that are a little overrated. Again, I'm not saying they're bad. Overrated just means they're not quite as good as people think. But I do think that they could win one of those games. And then if you look a little longer term, you're absolutely right. Coach Taggart right now, the one thing we knew that would be consistent and has been so far is he's a great recruiter. He's an elite recruiter. He was able to salvage Florida State's class this last year when Jimbo left. They went from, I think, number 54 in the country as Jimbo left to number 10 or 11, depending on what service you look at. You mostly look at 247. They have a composite ranking that makes a composite of all the recruiting services. So it seems to be the most accurate, if you can call it that. Taggart's going to recruit well. I had an interesting question that kind of is the reason this whole topic got brought up is, it seems as though a lot of teams in Florida, the state of Florida, are really trending up right now. You've got Charlie Strong at USF doing great things. Josh Heupel kind of taking up the mantle where Scott Frost left off. UCF still rolling. Now we'll see what happens when Mackenzie Milton graduates. But and then Mark Richt has kind of faltered a little bit this year, but it seems that he's going in the right direction with Miami. And then of course I'm a big Dan Mullen guy. I think he's a great coach. Florida's looking great right now. Had that loss to Kentucky for the first time in 30 years, but we found out Kentucky's actually a good team this year. So it's interesting. I think that, and I've said on this podcast that I think that it's very possible to see Willie Taggart that won't even be here the next couple of years, just because Florida State fans tend to be so, impatient, which is just a product of the success that we've had over the years. But I do think that if you look long term, this is a big, big year. These next 2 years are huge. You could end up with the first losing record for the first time in 41 years. I think only Notre Dame has a longer streak. So if you don't make it to 500, maybe you lose the bowl game, or if you don't even make a bowl game this year, you're looking at really history being made in the wrong way. And I think that won't sit well with Florida State fans. It could be a really big turning point, and he needs to do well next year. You're talking at least 8-4, probably 9-3 is going to be what people are looking for, and a much easier schedule next year. So I think that I'm not going to go doomsday right now and say, this is the year that we'll look back and say, well, that was the year that Florida State kind of went into, irrelevancy and is no longer, one of the main powers in college football. But if that does happen, this will be the season people point to. You know what I mean? And so it'll be interesting to see. I think that I haven't given up on Coach Taggart. There's a lot that he needs to get better at, and I think he will get better at it. This is his first big coaching gig at a school at this level. No offense, Oregon. We'll see what happens. I haven't given up on him yet.
Great. Well, we covered a bunch of different random topics. I can't wait to get into some other ones with you next week. I have a couple ideas of things I want to talk about already, but it's good to get back into conference play. It'll be really interesting to see what happens this weekend. We'll get to finally see if Wake Forest or Louisville gets to pull off, the amazing first conference win halfway through the season. Yeah. And we'll get to see if any seats get hotter and hotter as the season goes on. But NC State was exposed last weekend. Clemson's the main dog here in the ACC. Next week, I'm going to ask you questions like, do you want to see Clemson get upset? Do you think it would be fun to see, some new face there? Because it gets boring to see Alabama and Clemson and these teams, do well consistently. And it's kind of cool seeing Notre Dame and teams like Michigan back up top.
If you're asking me, would I love to see a Washington State-Texas playoff game?
That would be awesome.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because you don't know. Part of the draw to college football is some of these teams don't play each other. So if we saw Washington State and Texas play, no one would really know what's going to happen, and we would all tune in. Where Clemson, Alabama, while it's going to be a good game, I don't know. We kind of know what each team brings to the table. So I just can't wait to see what the rest of the season holds. Super glad Ohio State lost last weekend. Who knows, man? Maybe Alabama or Clemson are next. Well, thanks for joining us this week on ACC Audible. As I said, we're going to get those other podcasts posted up. We had our technical difficulties and a little hurricane interruption down there. No hurricanes up here in Michigan, fortunately. But for Ian and Ken, glad you joined us this week. We'll talk to you next week. Have fun watching ACC football.